He was never supposed to be there after midnight. The building was dark, quiet in the way only corporate offices get when everyone has gone home and decisions are made without witnesses. The single light on the top floor told him everything he needed to know. Someone was still working. Or more accurately, someone was still hiding something. He adjusted the strap of his worn bag on his shoulder, the same one he used to carry his daughter's lunchbox in the mornings, when she forgot it by the door. Being late at night meant missing her bedtime again. That guilt sat heavier than the fear climbing up his chest. He wasn't an executive. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't even important on paper. He was just a widowed father with a steady job, decent performance reviews, and a habit of noticing things he wasn't supposed to. Earlier that evening, while fixing a reporting error no one else wanted to stay for, he saw a folder that hadn't been closed properly. No password, no warning label, just a simple title that made his stomach drop. Restructuring, Phase 2. He didn't open it right away. He told himself it wasn't his business, that he had rent to pay, a child depending on him, and no margin for heroics. Kindness, after all, doesn't pay the bills. But then he saw the numbers. Hundreds of names, entire departments, timelines set just weeks before the holidays, severance minimized, silence encouraged. A clause at the bottom chilled him more than the layoffs themselves. Public disclosure prohibited until execution. That was when kindness stopped being optional. He thought of the people whose desks sat near his, the woman who brought extra soup for everyone, the intern sending half his paycheck back home, the security guard who worked double shifts so his wife could rest. He thought of his daughter asking him why some parents cried when they picked up their kids from school. He closed the file. His hands shook. By the time he realized what he was doing, he was already on the elevator. Now, standing outside the CEO's office, he questioned everything. One knock could end his career. One sentence could label him a threat. Power doesn't like being surprised, especially by people it overlooks. He knocked anyway. The door opened slower than expected. The CEO didn't look angry. That scared him more. Calm meant calculation. "What are you doing here?" the CEO asked, glancing at the clock. The single dad swallowed. His voice almost failed him. But he steadied it the way he did when his daughter woke from nightmares. "I need 5 minutes," he said. "And I need you to promise something first." The CEO raised an eyebrow. "You don't get to make promises here." He met the man's eyes, knowing this was the moment where courage either showed up or didn't. "Can you keep a secret?" That question changed the air in the room. The CEO closed the door. They sat across from each other, silence stretching longer than comfort allowed. The single dad spoke carefully. Not accusing, not emotional, just truthful. "I saw the files," he said. "The layoffs. The timing. The silence." The CEO leaned back, fingers steepled. "Then you understand why you shouldn't be here?" "I understand why you think no one would challenge it," he replied. "I also understand what happens to families when they're blindsided." The CEO's expression hardened. "This is business." He nodded. "So is trust. So is reputation. So is deciding who suffers quietly so numbers look clean." There was no shouting. No dramatic threats. Just two men separated by power and connected by consequence. "I'm not asking you to cancel it," the single dad continued. "I'm asking you to delay it. To restructure how it's done. To let people prepare." "And why would I listen to you?" the CEO asked. He took a breath, the kind you take before saying something that can't be unsaid. "Because if this goes through as planned, I'll leak it. Not for revenge, not for money, but because kindness sometimes looks like disobedience." The room went still. That was the betrayal part no one ever talks about, the betrayal of silence. The CEO studied him, finally seeing him not as a job title, but as a person with something to lose and something to protect. "You destroy your own life for strangers?" the CEO asked quietly. He thought of his daughter's face again. "I'd rather explain why I tried," he said, "than explain why I didn't." The clock ticked louder now. What the CEO didn't know was that this wasn't about bravery. It was about responsibility. When you've already lost everything once, fear stops working the same way. Finally, the CEO spoke. "If you're wrong, you're finished." He nodded. "If I'm right, hundreds of families get time." Another silence. Then the CEO stood, walked to the window, and stared down at the city full of people who would never know. How close they were to losing everything. "Leave," the CEO said, "and forget this conversation happened." The single dad stood, heart racing. At the door, the CEO added almost reluctantly, "If anyone asks, this never happened." He paused, hand on the handle. "That's the thing about kindness," he said softly. "It usually doesn't." And he walked out, not knowing whether he had just saved hundreds of families or quietly ruined his own. The days that followed felt heavier than the night he walked out of that office. Nothing changed on the surface. Emails stayed polite. Meetings stayed routine. Coffee machines still hummed like nothing was wrong. But underneath it all, something was shifting, and he could feel it in the pauses between conversations, in the way leadership suddenly stopped rushing decisions that had once felt urgent. He said nothing to anyone. That was the hardest part. At home, his daughter sensed the difference. She noticed how he stared too long at nothing, how he double-checked the door at night, how he hugged her just a little tighter before bed. She asked if he was sick. He smiled and said work was just busy. Kindness often looks like silence from the outside. A week passed, then two. Rumors started moving through the building like cautious whispers. Layoffs that were definitely happening suddenly weren't so certain. Dates were pushed. Meetings were rescheduled. A restructuring committee appeared overnight, filled with people no one expected to be invited into the room. People felt relief without understanding why. Then came the announcement, not the one everyone feared. Instead, leadership released a message about revised strategy, about long-term responsibility, about protecting families during uncertain times. Layoffs were reduced to a fraction of the original plan. Departments were given months to prepare. Support programs appeared where silence had been planned. Some cried in the break rooms. Some hugged. Some didn't believe it was real. No one looked at him. That was fine. He watched a coworker call her husband with shaking hands, saying she still had a job. He watched the intern email his parents that he wouldn't have to come home yet. He watched the security guard laugh for the first time in weeks. He went back to his desk and finished his work. Late one evening, an email arrived in his inbox with no subject line. One sentence inside. "Thank you for reminding me who this affects." No name, no signature. He deleted it. Weeks later, during a company-wide address, the CEO spoke about values, about leadership meaning more than profit, about doing the right thing even when no one would ever know. Applause filled the room. The single dad didn't clap, not because he was bitter, but because he understood something now. Kindness doesn't need recognition to be real. In fact, it often works best without it. He was never promoted, never publicly acknowledged. His name never appeared in any story, article, or internal message. What did appear were lives continuing as planned. Parents still packing lunches. Rent still being paid. Kids still sleeping in familiar beds. At home one night, his daughter asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Daddy," she said, "why do you always help people even when they don't say thank you?" He thought about the CEO's office, the locked door, the risk, the fear. He thought about how close everything had come to falling apart. "Because," he said carefully, "sometimes the best help is the kind that lets people believe things worked, out on their own." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to drawing. Months later, another restructuring rumor surfaced. Another quiet panic rippled through the building. This time, something was different. Leadership addressed it early, transparently, with preparation and support. Kindness, once introduced, has a way of changing systems. He eventually left the company, not pushed out, not forced. He found another job closer to home. With fewer hours and less prestige, it paid a little less. It gave him a little more life. On his last day, the CEO stopped him in the hallway. "No witnesses, no speeches." "You could have destroyed me," the CEO said quietly. He shook his head. "That was never the goal." "Why do it then?" He smiled, tired but peaceful. "Because power listens differently when it's surprised by decency." The CEO extended a hand. He shook it, brief and firm. They never spoke again. Years later, none of the families he helped would know his name. They would never know how close they came to losing everything, or how one ordinary person stood between them and that outcome. And that was exactly how it was meant to be. Because the strongest kindness doesn't ask to be seen. The bravest heroes don't need applause. And sometimes, the most powerful question in the world isn't shouted at all. It's whispered after midnight, behind a closed door. Can you keep this secret?